Greetings viewers, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're finally back on the 2007 Outback SUS 2.5i Limited. That's a mouthful. So this is the $300 Outback we picked up, I believe in the beginning of March. Blown head gasket, several other issues. We did several other videos linked in whichever corner I could never remember with the mirrored screen on the camera, which way to point. But I think it's that way. It might be that way. Whichever, it'll pop up and show you everything wrong with the car and the initial video on the car. But as far as what we're doing today, we already rebuilt the power steering pump in that video. I forgot about that video. But today we're gonna go ahead and get the engine out of this car so we can go through, reseal the engine, do the head gaskets, and do everything mechanically to the engine we need to do to get this car ready to go, aside for a few things like the suspension bushings, a set of tires, and the other things we talked about in the inspection video. So we're not doing a step-by-step DIY engine pull. I've done a couple of those in the past. I don't know how many things I can link, but I'll link that somewhere as well. I did it on a 2001 H6, I believe it was an LL Bean, but the 3-liter and the 2.5s are nearly identical to pull, other than the fact you got 2 extra cylinders. There's not much difference in pulling the 2 engines. So we're gonna do a basic overview of what you need to do to get these engines out. I'm gonna go ahead and pull it out, throw it on the engine stand in the shop, and that'll be it for this video. So all in all, pulling an engine on a Subaru is a pretty simple job. It's one of the easiest vehicles to pull an engine on, in my opinion. It's also a very quick job if you know what you're doing. I think my record time at pulling a Subaru engine is about 38 minutes, the last time I timed myself, but that was on a 2.2 manual transmission. Automatic takes a little bit more time, having to deal with the torque converter as well as the transmission cooler lines. But anyway, so starting underneath the car, everything you need to do in one step without having to go back and forth, top and bottom, top and bottom. Underneath the car, there are 2 14mm nuts that are located on the cross member. These nuts hold the bottom engine mounts to the cross member. So a 14mm on each side. Back behind that, there are 2 14mm nuts at the bottom of the bell housing. There are 2 long threaded studs that come from the engine into the transmission, and there are 2 14mm nuts with washers. Go ahead and remove those. Above those are 2 14mm headed bolts. You can either remove them from below or above. They're fairly easy to access above. Actually, a little bit easier to access from above than below, because below the CV axle is kind of in your way. Beyond that, on this particular model, with this particular exhaust manifold, there are 3 14mm nuts at the exhaust manifold to front pipe flange you can take loose. On the older EJs, you go ahead and take the 6 14mm nuts loose from the exhaust manifold, and I usually just drop the exhaust manifold with the front pipe and the whole exhaust system and hold it in place with a bungee below the vehicle. But on this one, I think 2005, 2006, when they changed the exhaust manifold, where it wraps in front of the engine and comes to a 3-bolt flange right at the cross member. You can pull the engine with the exhaust manifold attached relatively easily. Behind that, there is a 14mm bolt on the front pipe. You may need to take it out and get the front pipe loose from that bracket so it drops down enough to release when you pull the engine. But sometimes you don't have to remove it, but just so you're wary of that. Also, while you're underneath there, you might as well remove the lower 14mm nut on the bottom of the starter. You can access it from the top, but it is a little bit easier to get with a wobble socket or a swivel socket with a long extension from underneath. And as far as I can recall right now, that is everything you need to disconnect at the back side of the engine underneath. Moving forward, go ahead and remove your 17mm drain plug, drain your engine oil. You don't want to have to drain it on the engine stand, might as well drain it now. Once you have drained the engine oil on the older EJs that were far easier to access the engine block coolant drains because of the exhaust manifold design on those. A 14mm hex plug is what is on either side of the engine block. You can drain all the coolant from the engine block. Makes it a lot easier when you go to disassemble the engine, as you don't have an engine full of coolant that's going to spill out all over the engine stand when you pull the heads and everything else on it. From there, you can go ahead and remove your lower radiator hose. You can remove the heat shield from the transmission that guards the automatic transmission cooler lines. Remove those lines and crimp them off. Crimp off the rubber line, not the metal line. You'll ruin your radiator if you do. And then you can go ahead and disconnect the 2 connectors for the cooling fans. And as far as I can recollect right now, that's all you do underneath. I might be forgetting something. So once that's all done, flip top side. You can remove the 2 12mm headed bolts, and on these 2005 to 2009 models, the 10mm headed bolt that hold the hood prop in place. Remove those, and then you should be able to pull the radiator with the fans and the coolant reservoir straight up and out of the car. If you've removed the upper radiator hose, I forgot to mention that, you got one clamp here, pull the upper radiator hose off, then you can pull it all up as an assembly. Once that's done, go ahead and remove your air box, your air pipe, your air intake chamber at the throttle body. 2 10mm headed bolts hold it to the stands, 8mm worm gears, clamps, and it all comes off. You've got the mass air connector at the air box. The air box itself, the lower part with the silencer, has a 10mm headed bolt that bolts it to the frame rail, and a 10mm headed 10mm nut that holds it to right behind the passenger side headlight. Pull that all up as an assembly. From there, you can remove both your AC and alternator power steering belt. Once those are removed, you can remove the power steering pump, 1 electrical connector on the power steering pump, 3 12mm headed bolts, 1 behind, 2 on the front side of the engine. Once that's removed, you can swing the power steering pump with all lines attached and fluid over and drop it into the cavity that was where the air box resided. You don't have to take any lines loose or spill any power steering fluid. You can then unbolt your alternator, which you do have to unbolt a 12mm headed bolt between the alternator and the power steering bracket. There's a 12mm headed bolt on the opposite side of the alternator. So 2 12s, the alternator's free. You got a 12mm nut for the main power wire on top of the alternator, and you also have a connector for the alternator, and then it can come out as well. Moving over to the AC compressor, you have 1 electrical connector at the front of the clutch pulley assembly on the AC compressor. You then have 2 clamps for the wiring harness that holds the wiring for the alternator and the AC compressor. You can snake that back out, tuck it over where the battery was. As far as the AC compressor, there are 4 14mm headed bolts on the bracket. Unbolt the bracket and compressor as a unit and let it sit there. When you go to remove the engine, you'll simply take the AC compressor and flip it over with the lines attached into the cavity that the battery was in. Before you do that though, there's a 10mm headed bolt at the firewall that holds the AC line in place. You need to remove that to give yourself just a little extra wiggle room to get the engine past and get the AC lines to move enough to flip that compressor over. That basically handles everything on the front side of your engine. From there, you go to the back side of the engine. So first off, from the top down, you're gonna remove your throttle body. 4 10mm headed bolts. You'll have an electrical connector for the actual electronic throttle control, electronic connector for the, I believe, map sensor, and you have 2 coolant hoses to remove at the throttle body as well. Remove the throttle body so you can access the torque converter bolts. Directly below the throttle body and to the left is an access cover. This access cover will allow you to get to the 4 12mm headed torque converter bolts. You'll need a 22mm socket and a 1/2" drive ratchet to rotate the engine around, and each 90-degree rotation you will find a 12mm headed bolt between the flex plate and the torque converter. Remove those through the access hole. Once you've removed all 4, the torque converter and flex plate are now separated. Moving behind that, you need to go ahead and remove, I believe it's a total of 5 or 6 14mm headed bolts that bolt the transmission to the engine block. One of these is for your starter. It's the upper starter bolt. You have a 12mm nut for the main power wire to the back of the starter. You also have a single pin connector to the starter solenoid. Remove both of those wires and that top bolt, and your starter can now come out. From there, you've got 2 spring clamps for the heater hoses. Remove those spring clamps and remove the 2 heater hoses from the heater core to the hard pipes on the back side of the engine. On the passenger side or right-hand side of the vehicle is the main bulkhead power connector for the whole engine harness. One flip of the connector and the entire engine wiring is separated from the body. One quick disconnect and you are done there. From there, you only have one more bolt and nut to loosen up, and that is the 14mm bolt and nut at the pitch stopper. That's the big dog bone looking mount from the firewall to the top of the transmission bell housing. You need to remove that to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room when you jack up the transmission, just to clear the studs on the engine mounts and the cross member before removing the engine. Then onto the driver's side, the last things you need to remove are your fuel feed line, your fuel return line, and your vacuum hose to your vacuum brake booster. So as far as I can recollect from memory standing here, that's everything you need to remove to get this engine completely freed up. From there, there's an eyelet at the back of the right in front of the ignition coil on the intake manifold. That's normally where I hook my engine load leveler chains to, is that eyelet. And then on the front, I'll usually pick 1 or 2 of the 14mm headed bolts that secure the AC compressor bracket to the block. I'll hook the front side of the engine load leveler there. And that's basically it. You take a block of wood, jack up with a floor jack under the front differential. You jack up just enough for the engine and transmission to come up where the studs on the bottom engine mounts clear their holes in the front cross member. After that's done, you can apply a little bit of upward tension with your engine hoist, wiggle the engine back and forth till it breaks free of the transmission. You northerners may have a time of this because the alignment dowels are made of steel and they go into an aluminum transmission, an aluminum engine block, and a lot of times they seize together. So you may have to take a very thin chisel or a very thin old flathead screwdriver and try to drive it between the crack between the engine and transmission to get them to free up, because they can get stuck together. Be careful when you do this. You can crack the aluminum engine block, you can crack the aluminum bell housing, you can break chunks out of either. I've seen it happen. So take your time and be patient when doing this so as not to cause some major damage. So once that's done, wiggle the two, break them free. Be careful when doing so on automatic transmission cars. You don't want to pull the torque converter out from the transmission. What I normally do is take a pry bar and go between the engine block and the torque converter and push from the engine block against the torque converter, because sometimes the alignment snub, the little point that comes off the end of the torque converter and goes in the end of the crankshaft, sometimes they can seize together, and you can either break off the end of the torque converter alignment snub, or you can have it get seized in the back of the crankshaft and it'll want to pull the torque converter out of the transmission. You don't want to do that. You can hurt the torque converter seal, you can cause a leak, you can hurt the front pump, all kinds of bad things. So make sure the torque converter does not pull out with the transmission. Make sure you've unbolted it from the flex plate. Once that's done, just make sure you don't swing the engine too far forward to hit your AC condenser and put a hole in it. That would be a very bad time. You just need to pull it forward enough where the bottom two 14mm studs clear the transmission bell housing, and then you simply lift it out and you are all set. So again, it's a pretty simple procedure, especially on the later EJ253, as they made it a much easier, more modular package. The single wiring harness, bulkhead connector, and the way they package the exhaust, it makes it a lot easier to pull the whole engine as one solid unit than the older EJs that had, I believe, 2, some had 3 main connectors for the engine harness, and the fact that you had to drop the exhaust manifold normally instead of pulling it out with it attached to the engine. So that said, we're going to go ahead and pull this engine out now. A little unconventionally, I don't have an engine hoist out here, so I'm going to use the front end loader of my tractor to pull this thing out, and we'll end the video out there. All right, so engine is safely into the building, and on the engine stand, got the exhaust manifold off already. Right there, got the flex plate off. Guys, do not get complacent in your work. It'll cost you. I busted a hole in the condenser. Luckily I had another one, but not what I wanted to do, so yeah. Always be careful. Always smart to put a piece of cardboard or even a piece of thin plywood between the engine and the condenser so you don't puncture it with the harmonic balancer or heat shields on the exhaust manifold. But got off the flex plate so you can see the back here, rear main seal's been leaking, oil air separator plate's been leaking. Piston pin access cover is still dry, but we're going to go ahead and put the O-ring in it, of course, when we get it in the kit. Massive oil leaks here between the head gasket and the head. Rocker covers have been leaking as well. So way past time for these head gaskets. A lot of people ask me, how is it that you can tell, as you said, visually looking at the car, which head gaskets are in it before taking it apart? And it's pretty simple. Here's our head gasket right here protruding between the block and the head. And if you, as you can see, maybe if I can get the camera right, you can see it's one piece of steel, single layer, and you can see the coating on either side. Hard to see with the grunge and build up there. But if you look back there, you can see that little silver shimmer in the center of the head gasket. And looking where I'm looking, I can see that it's the coated single layer gasket. The MLS gasket, of course, you'll see several layers and it'll be a little bit thicker, but that's how you can look without having to remove your engine to see if it has the original single layers or if it has had the MLS gaskets installed on it. So with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.